not have the dream crusher in your life, but someone that you can go to and say, here, like someone that's going to be real with you and honest about your idea, not in a negative way, but somebody, a good sounding board. Looking for that person in your life, whether that's another, like I am incredibly blessed because I've got a couple founders that I just reached out to on LinkedIn and I said, hey, you're where I want to be in the auto space. Can we chat? Right. And they've been great at, like, and it's interesting because they're very diametrically opposed founders of companies in their philosophy of growth and that stuff. So I've got two, but to be honest with you and say that's not a good idea or that's a great idea and here's why, because there are holes that we all have, even as multi-time founders. There are things you miss that if you have somebody else just like throw back at you. That would be my advice. Is
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of the Inventive Journey. I'm your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7- and 8-figure businesses, as well as a CEO and founder of Miller IP Law, where we help startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. You ever need help with yours? Just go to strategymeeting.com. We're always here to help. Now, today we have another great guest. I say that about all guests, and I feel the same way about all guests. They are all great guests, but we have Stephen Granger on. And Stephen Granger is the founder of Recall Rabbit, and he'll talk a little bit about that throughout his journey. But to give you a brief introduction, went to college for about a year, didn't like school, and wanted to be a professional cyclist, I think. And he was married to an Olympian, which sounds cool, which hopefully it is cool. But got into sales after cycling. That didn't work out. Became an entrepreneur for a long time and had that kind of entrepreneur spirit. Started a business with a friend in the 90s, built it for a period of time, didn't work out in the long run, moved over to being a recruiter until the dot-com bust, started selling cars, which sounds like fun. I love cars, so I'm always a car guy. But then didn't like that, moved over to car accessories, moved on over to Carfax for a period of time, went through life changes and left, did another startup, did an accelerator, raised a bit of money, learned what not to do and what hopefully to do a bit, shut it down after doing that for a period of time. Went back to work, worked as a manager at a dealership, saw a problem, which led now to where his business is at today. So with that much as a brief introduction, welcome on the podcast, Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very good. Just one small correction. I didn't marry the Olympic athlete. I was engaged to one. So yeah.
Oh, I got it wrong.
That's right. If she ever saw the podcast, she would be very clear about that. So yeah. Yeah.
All right. Fair enough. Well, I'm still interested to see what it was like to be engaged to an Olympian.
Yes.
So we'll have to talk about that. But as we dive into things, I gave that brief introduction, kind of went through everything, but take us a bit back to when things started, when you started out in college and kind of how your journey got started there.
Yeah. So yeah, you touched on it. The college experience I realized was not for me. I went to a very, very small liberal arts school in Missouri. I used to say it was kind of like high school with fraternities. There were 786 total students. At one point, it was an all-male school. There was another school in the town that was an all-female school. So there were more technically students in the vicinity. But yeah, it was not a very exciting experience for me. So I had raced bicycles in high school, loved it. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to live the dream, go try and do it. And so, yeah, after a year of school, I packed up my things, moved to the mountains in California near Lake Tahoe. I had a friend from high school whose family owned a cabin and let me live there for no rent. And that's when I met the Olympic swimmer she was the world champion. She was a synchronized swimmer. She was the world champion at what she did, and then eventually won a gold medal in the Olympics. And meeting somebody like that, I realized whatever she had that made her the world champion at what she did, I did not have. It was kind of a soul crushing experience, but a life lesson. And kind of got into sales after that and started my career.
Question, because that is interesting, both on the, so she got a gold, which is cool. Were you engaged, dating at the time when she got the gold, or did? Okay.
No, right before the gold medal, the Olympics. It's kind of a funny story. So I broke off the engagement. My mom ended up going to the Olympics because it was a neat experience, and she always tells a story. It was very funny to be there even though her son no longer dated the Olympian. But yeah, yes, we were dating during that whole time.
Now,
Um,
and I'm just curious on the
yeah,
Olympian, are they crazy focused and hype,
yes,
have and almost
yeah.
have to be, I'd
And
assume.
that's
So,
so this will give you a good story of one of the moments where I was like, wow, okay. So she would get up every morning at like 5 o'clock, go to the pool, swim from 6 a.m. till 6 at night, 6 days a week, and then go to junior college at night.
mm,
And one day I asked her, like, you know how most of us, we wake up and we're like, I just don't have it today. I'm going to call in sick. And then you kind of work through that and you power through and you're like, all right, I'm going to the office. I asked her one day if she ever feels like that. And she looked at me with a look on her face like I might have well asked her if she eats babies whole. Like she just was, and she said, that thought has literally never entered my brain. And I remember so distinctly going, well, I guess that's why you're the world champion and I'm selling copiers, right? So yeah, she definitely, and I used to think about it too. Like there's a reason Michael Jordan's Michael Jordan,
mm,
right? He's
mhm.
different. If he wasn't, we'd all be like Michael Jordan, but we're not, right? So yeah, there is a different mentality to people who are high level achievers. And it was really funny because her coach was a very big negative reinforcement person.
Mm.
And she would try that with me and I'd be like, yeah, I just hear I'm a loser. You're not like really motivating me. And she thought that like work was going to be like that. And I kept telling her, like, no one is ever going to talk to you in a business environment the way your coach talks to you. I remember she got like her first job and reached out to me and was like, I have to apologize to you because you were right. Like work is so easy. And I was like, yes, that's what I kept telling you. No, like your life's gonna be way easier after this. So yeah.
Oh, that's funny. So no, that is a good story. Now, one,
Yeah.
so now you said in your own words or paraphrasing your own words, you dated the Olympian and were engaged for a period of time, didn't work out, but you also kind of had your soul crushed, so to speak, in the sense, I'm not going to be that
Yeah.
Olympian, cyclist, and so better to realize that now and do something else. So you went into sales for a period of time, and then how did your journey kind of progress after you
Yeah.
did sales, and then you got into some entrepreneur, doing some
Sure.
startup, doing things with the startup? So how did that go?
Yeah. So in looking back, and I'm sure this is a common theme against, right? Like most startup founder entrepreneurial people, like even as a little kid, I always thought about starting my own business and doing stuff, right? And
Mm.
so I became a technical recruiter after the sales. I just kind of fell into that. It was the early beginnings of the .com era. And I worked for a national company. We had an office in Texas. I had originally grown up in Texas, but had moved to California in middle school and had family in Texas. And I came to visit and fell in love with Austin specifically. And I wanted to transfer. And so I transferred offices and came here and met became my best friend. And we just like, Austin was really starting to grow company wise. And we would call these companies and they had no idea the name of the company we worked for. And we had this kind of aha moment over a beer or something like, you know, it's funny to think back young, like how naive you are when you're young. And you're like,
Mhm.
we were like, we're giving away 90% of the money to this company that basically provides a phone for us. Like
Mm.
the customer they're buying because they like you and me. Like they trust us. And that's why they're buying, not because it says the name of the company on the phone. Right. And so
Sure.
we're like, we'll do it ourselves. So we just, in the spare bedroom of his house, started. I used to joke later after I got married that I must have been a hell of a salesperson because he was married, newly married, really young. They just got a house, had a mortgage, and I got him to convince his wife to quit his day job and start this technical recruiting company. And we did that, like you said, through the .com era and learned, looking back, a lot of just silly, dumb lessons as a young person, right? In an economy that was growing and you like almost despite ourselves, we were making lots of money, right? And
Mm.
then the .com bubble burst and nobody needed recruiters anymore. And it was kind of like okay, well now what? But I still,
Mm.
I'm a salesy guy and I love cars, right? And my ex-wife at the time, she said, well, you love Audis. Why don't you go try and sell Audis? And so that's how I got into the automotive space in
Mm.
like 2001. I started selling cars. And unlike what you said earlier, it is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Like it was,
Really?
I learned that. I did it for about 7, 8 months, that first stretch. And yeah, it's a very difficult job. And I give lots of credit to those people because, it's what most people don't understand. It's 100% commission, like
Hmm.
literally 100%, to the point where at that time we had what's called a mini, where if you're a salesperson and Devin, beat you up down to like the price is nothing and they don't make any money, you get a minimal amount as a salesperson. And it was $50. And
Really?
so, like, if I spent 3 days with you and you had beat me up and you finally bought the Jetta, I'd make $50, right? And it was just
Hmm.
it's hard. It's a hard way to learn a living. And so that's how I got into the vendor side. And like you mentioned, I worked for Carfax for 12 years, and that was a great learning experience because it was a big brand, but not a really very small company. And they were just kind of pushing out into selling to dealers. They had been a consumer facing product and were making this transition. And so I was the first person in the role that I had, and grew with them for I worked there a little over almost 11 years. And
Hmm.
looking back now as a founder, there's so many things that I just kind of didn't realize I was learning, right? From a company that was growing and doing well, the things that you just see in looking back. So
No, I think that definitely makes it. Now, I wanted to touch back. So you got into sales for a period of time and
mhm.
even did car sales. Now, I've never done car sales. I just like cars. I mean, give you
Yeah,
an idea, the first
that's how
car
I
that
did
I
it.
ever drove, I drove in high school was a 67 Camaro that me and my dad restored. So
Okay.
I love
Wow.
cars. Now I also have completely opposite side, but I do have a VW. It's the old VW bus. It's has a bed
Okay.
that folds down the background or the back.
Awesome.
That's for the fun with the wife and the kids. So I'm just a car guy that love
Yeah.
that. But so you do that for a period of time and say, okay, while I like cars, car sales is not the most fun, and it's also incredibly competitive. That's why when they get on there, they're not really on your side to give you the best deal because they want to get the most. Otherwise, you only make
Right.
$50 after a while.
Yes. Yeah.
But you did that and said, okay, tried the few different sales job. I did the recruiting .com bust. That didn't work out. Then got over to car sales and said, okay, can't do car sales. Our car sales are not fun and they're a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
Get into Carfax for a period of time, and then I think you said you went through some life changes and decided that you were going to leave Carfax and
Yes.
go to another startup. Is that right?
Yeah. I went through a divorce, and if anybody is listening to the podcast, you can relate. Like, your brain isn't working probably 100% efficiently, and made some decisions and left Carfax, and went to a smaller technology company in the space. Again, a good life lesson. Really incredibly smart people. Learned a lot about product because they were launching a new product. So I got to be involved in that, where it was a great, like, almost like a boot camp for startups, because they had lots of money and they had a core product that was revenue generator, and then they were launching this new thing, and they brought me in to help with that. And so I got to learn on somebody else's nickels, like what to do, what not to do as you grow and scale. Now, the not startup piece of it is they had lots of money, right? So they could make
Mm-hmm.
mistakes and go down a path where, as a startup founder, you can't normally do that, right? So yeah, did that for a while. And like I said, I mentioned, you touched on it in my intros. Then uh, I went from like, I love the auto space. Like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
like you, I'm a car guy. I'm passionate about it. And what I'm passionate about is car dealers are actually, they're very good people. Like, when people bash on them, I always try and kind of turn it down to, like, when you look in a community, typically they're the largest employer in a community because they have so many staff. They give more to charity than anybody else in their community. I mean, how many of us have kids who's on a little league team that's sponsored by the local car dealer, right? Like, they do a lot of good stuff. And so my frustration has always been, um, kind of on how do we in the technology space figure out how to use technology to make that process better and better for the consumer. And so, I launched a startup to help do that. And my startup was, it was called Sales Dog. And the idea was, it was an application for salespeople inside the dealership, that it was basically a game. And the idea was, by playing this game, it would help them better understand engaging customers and their product, because this is the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems I think in the space is that there's not a lot of training for the salesperson, right? And so they're kind of thrown to the wolves. You as a consumer come in and you typically know more about the car because you're super passionate about this car. So you've spent like the average time a consumer spends is like 80 hours online. Well, that salesperson, he or she spent 5 minutes getting ready for you. So you're super prepared and they're not. And so the idea was to build an application to help that was fun so they could do it. And then our secret sauce, we called it manage gaming. And so the manager could actually change it, right? So if you and I worked at the store, your game's questions would be different than mine because our skill sets were different, right? Like you may need help in a different area. And so went down that path and got into an accelerator and built out an app and did all the stuff you're supposed to do in a startup that you think, and it went sideways.
No, and not pouring any wound, but I think, or salt in the wound, but I'd love to talk about that for just a minute, in the sense of, there are things, you can have a great, and I think, just sitting there and explain, that makes sense. You want to, as a consumer, you want a salesperson that has a good background. They know the car, they can tell you the benefits, they can tell you why get this upgrade or why. Now, don't just tell me I need an upgrade because it's better. Like, tell me why I need it, or why should I get this car, this minivan over this minivan, or this truck or this car over this car. And half the time, to your point, the consumer spends so much time online, especially when it's not all out there. They've read the reviews, they've read all this, and you've got hundreds of different cars and options on the line. You're saying, I don't know all these things. So gamifying it and making it, fun and interesting and incentivizing definitely makes sense. And so I can see why you got into the accelerator, raised a bit of money on it. But tell us a little bit, kind of, what did you, what made it go sideways, or kind of what did you learn as it went sideways?
And this is something that I, at first, when it went sideways, I thought, oh, this is going to be bad for future, because I'm an entrepreneur. Like, I was listening to one of your other podcasts, and it was the guy from Cox. I can't remember what, and he was like, now that I'm doing this, I can't imagine not, right? And that's kind of the thing. Like, once you've been an entrepreneur, it's hard to visualize going back to work for somebody. Like, I've done it a couple times, and it works for a little while, but you get that bug, right? The thing that I learned, and this is advice I would give any potential founder, is don't go spend a bunch of money building something that you think, and the key word is you think, people are going to spend money on, because that's what I did. I thought it made sense. Like you said, makes total sense. But when I went to my potential customers and said, hey, I have this thing, and even they, like, we got lots of perks for, like, oh, this is great. Like, it looks cool. The app's functional, right? But at the end of the day, nobody would write a check. Like, when I would push and be like, okay, cool, you want to, it's $700 a month. No. Or whatever the number, right? And this is the other thing that a learning lesson I took away from. So one, don't spend a bunch of money to build something that somebody's not going to actually write a check for. And two, this is a yin and yang, right? Like, don't be so focused on making money, which I know sounds so crazy counterintuitive. And if I heard myself say that, I'd be like, you're bananas, dude. But, like, that's what I was so laser focused on, that I couldn't just maybe take a step back and go, okay, let me have somebody try it for free. Right. And then see how it would work.
Just a minimal amount, and what I always, and I agree with you on all of that. On the one sense, you need to make sure people, because there's a difference between something that's cool or something that's useful and something people are willing to pay for, in the sense that they may think, yeah, that's a really good idea, I'd use it. And then you're like, well, would you pay for it? Not necessarily me, but I'm sure somebody else out there would pay for it. And you're like, we got a problem. And so I think that that's a real thing that you talk yourself into. Hey, it's a cool idea. You start to almost drink your own Kool-Aid because you get so enamored with the idea that you don't necessarily think, hey, would somebody actually pay for this? Does this have a business case? Not just this is a cool product that.
And let's be also on it. Like, we're all bananas doing this, right? At some level, because you're like, we're doing what society tells us not to do. So you have to fight, like, you have to have a little bit in that you anyways, like, about your idea. Like, if you're not passionate about it, it's startup is hard anyways, but if you're not
It is
truly
hard,
passionate, you're right.
and I always think there's a bit of naivety in the sense that, you know, if you're not passionate about it, you're not going to make, and because, you know, startups are hard. There's a high failure rate, and yet we're bucking the trend saying, yeah, I know there's a lot of failures, but I'm going to be the exception. And
Yeah.
sometimes you are the exception,
And
sometimes
you
you're
have
not.
to. You
But I
have to
think
do
you have
that.
to have that broken risk meter and willing to
Yeah.
accept the risk and continue to move forward and do it anyway. So, and the other thing I think you touched on, I liked as well, is, you know, sometimes you get there, you need to have money to make it or to keep a business going. And I think that sometimes that gets pushed aside, like, oh, we'll make money
No.
and we'll figure it out. But on the other hand, if you become so focused on money, hey, we have to make money now, we have to do it right now, that you
Yeah.
sometimes don't give the product enough time to figure out what it's
Yeah.
going to be.
And that was the number one thing that, like, it was like the idea was great. Like, obviously we got into Accelerator. We beat out a bunch of other companies because the idea was good, but there was a chicken and the egg effect that I needed to be able to say to a dealer, and this is the not money part, that this would, if I was going to do that again, is I needed people using the tool to prove its validity, to then go to people and say, hey, it really works. It's worth the spend. Because I didn't have that. I was so focused on, like, I need to make some money to eat, that I couldn't get initial users to then prove, right? That's what I mean. Like, I was in another startup. It was kind of an 8-week program where you come in with a basic idea, and by the end of the 8 weeks, you've got kind of something shelled out. And each week you have an expert that tells you, like, finance, marketing. It was a great program here at a company in Austin. And one of the things the guy said to me in that, like, was so glad, like, if you're not making any money, it's a hobby. Like, you can call it whatever you want. You can have a web page, but at the end of the day, if you don't have paying customers, it's a hobby. So don't get me wrong when I say, like, don't focus on money. Like, money, coming up with a revenue model is very important.
But I think that you've got to do it in the time frame that makes
Yes.
sense. I think that's what you're hitting on. If
Yeah.
you're so early on focused about, and not that you shouldn't have a plan or you shouldn't say, hey, here's where we go about doing it. But if you're so focused on the money aspect that you never figure out what the product is going to be, where does it fit in the marketplace? Where does it make sense? Where does it not make sense? And if you never give it that a time to evolve, you can kill it, not because it's not a good idea, but because you didn't figure out, what are people willing to pay for it? What do I charge for this? Where are they going to use it? How are they going to use it? What is my pitch?
Exactly.
And so I think that's, you know, good lessons to learn as to why you can have a good idea that, as you said, can go sideways, not because it's not one that, you know, it's not a good idea, but because there are other aspects that impact it. And I think it's a good lesson to learn from.
Yeah.
So now you did that. You went back to the dealership for a period of time. And now I can't remember, are you still at the dealership or are you back doing full-time work?
So, so the dealership experience is what gave birth to Recall Rabbit, right? And I've tried to take a lot of the lessons I learned from that first startup and push it into what we're doing today, and it's worked, right? And so I was at a 7-store dealer group. I was a manager overseeing their digital, everything to do with digital and some used car stuff. And I known about recalls from my time at Carfax. And all of a sudden I just started kind of looking at our inventory, and we had about 1,600 cars on the used side between the 7 different stores. And when I started looking at it and diving in, there were, at the time, I think it was about 27% of all the cars that we had a recall that were not our own brand. So, like, it was Mazda and Hyundai's. So if we had a Chevy, 27% of them had recalls. And I was like, this is great. I mean, when you do the math, that's a lot of cars, right? And it shows on the Carfax or the auto check report. So consumers see it online. That's what was bubbling up to me. I was like, this is worrisome as a consumer, and we need to figure this out so we can sell these cars, right? And so when I started asking how, like, what do we do? There was no answer. And it was this weird little moment of, like, holy cow, this is a huge problem, because 1 in 4 cars in the United States has a recall. It's between 65 and 70 million cars. Every day there are new recalls announced. Honda just announced 2.6 million cars. So it's like every day, and every manufacturer, like even Tesla, has recalls. Like, it doesn't matter what it is, there's recalls. And when I started digging, I realized there was no good way to connect dealers to fix this, because you can only fix your own brand by law, right? So if I'm a Ford store, I can only fix Fords, which makes sense, right? If you think about, like, I don't want the Ford guy fixing the Chevy airbag because he doesn't work on Chevys, right? Um, but there was no good way to connect them. And this is partially because of the infrastructure inside a dealership and the way people are incentivized and their compensation structure. A lot of people inside the dealership are paid commission. This is a weird thing that falls kind of in the cracks of that because no one can get directly paid for fixing it or getting it fixed. And it's their time. Like, it takes time to take the car to the other dealership, bring it back. Well, who's going to pay for that person's time? Right. Those are the little weird things that we help solve with our tool. And so I was like, okay, I see something. I'm not going to go spend a bunch of money. I learned the lesson. So literally my first thing, I went to somebody I'd worked with in the past and I said, here's my idea. Would you pay for it if I could come up with the idea? And he's like, yes, makes sense. And I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I literally did it manually. I got an Excel spreadsheet, went out to Auto Trader, Cars, Carfax, looked for Volkswagens. It was a Volkswagen store, looked for them manually around their dealership. Then I would take the VIN and manually go to VolkswagenRecalls.com USA and see if it has a recall. And if it did, I would then put the information in the spreadsheet, send it to the guy and say, okay, here are all the Volkswagens for sale around you that have recalls. Here's all the information you need on the car and the person to connect with. Right. And so I did it manually for the first probably 5 or 6 customers because I was like, if nobody's going to pay for it, there's no point in building it. And if I'm not making enough money from it, no point in building it. And once I get to a point that I just can't do it anymore, it's frustrating. Let's figure out automation. And so that's one of the lessons I learned from my first experience. And it worked. Right. And so still was.
And I like the kind of the lesson from the story is, hey, you don't have to always dump in a ton of money, build it all. Let's see if we can do it manually. See if people will pay for it. Even if I have to take 10 times the amount of effort, time, and money to do it, let's see if, theoretically, if I were to get this to work and if people would pay for it, then I can figure out, okay, now let's go figure out how to build it, automate it, make it nicer, make it polished, make it easier, make it more streamlined. But, rather than just go out and build it all, let's try the minimalist route to see if it makes an. I never like minimally viable product in the sense that in my mind, it always seems like that just is a code for we're going to put out a crappy product and see if people buy it anyway. So I don't think that's the case, but I think, hey, let's see if there's a way that we can do it without having to do a major investment such so they can get that same experience, see if it will work, and also learn a lot. I think a lot of times you put it out, you do it manually, say, oh, this is what you really need to know. This is what you really need to do.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because I know I've watched a couple of your podcasts and there are a lot of us who are not technologists, right? And you can go down the path of, I think this is what I want to build. And we don't know, right? Like we think, oh, well, you just go back in a little room, you type a little stuff, then boom, it comes up. It's easy, right? No big deal. And my CTO always is like,
it's not hard at all.
Yeah. I hate when you explain our product because you make it sound like it's super easy. There's a lot of hard work. But so you can go down a path and one little mistake takes hours and hours to fix that you don't understand. And that's one of the good things about being a technical recruiter is I quasi understand the development life cycle, but now as a founder, I understand it much more deeply. And again, by doing it manually, you avoid all that. And it's easy to change and manipulate. And there are enough tools out there that you can figure out how to do stuff that you need to if you've got a niche that you want to try and attack. So did the manual thing, worked doing it nights and weekends, found somebody to help me build some automation, but not full automation. And I have a good friend who I mentioned, my best friend earlier, that we were recruiters together, had our own agency. We both left that and went to work internally as recruiters for software companies. And he did that. He's still doing recruiting. And one of the guys he worked for that was the vice president of development, we all became friends. This is another piece of advice I might get. So, and he'll hate it if he sees this, but we lovingly call him the dream crusher because I'm an entrepreneur, and you may know Dev, and you've probably talked to enough. Like I'm always coming up with great ideas, right? And he's a great sounding board. So I would always recommend like find somebody you know and really trust that can really kick you in the teeth, and you're like, okay. And he's one of those ones where he's like, this is the dumb idea, or he pokes the holes in it. That's good. You're like, even if it's a a bad idea. It might work if somebody's helping you figure that out. Well, this other gentleman is he's now my CTO, but he's my technical version of that, right? So as a non-technologist, when I think of an idea, I go to him and I'm like, how much would this take to really build? If I'm talking to somebody who's going to be a developer, what should I be looking for? And he's always been a great sounding board for that. And I came to him with this idea after I'd already built out some of it. And I said, look, we're here. I need to figure out how to get it to here to make it real. And he was like, I like this one, man. This one's actually a good one. I want to come on board. So he joined as my CTO, and his team has helped build out what we have now, which is a fully automated tool. We've got customers. I think since the first time I talked to you, I'm in an office space now. When we first talked, I was still out of the house, and I started full-time last January, right before COVID. So on paper, not the best time to start your startup, but what we do for dealers actually helped them during COVID make revenue. So it was kind of a good time for us to start and grow.
No, and I think that's fun. Interesting. There's been a lot of startups during the time of COVID, just because people have, they're at home, either they're on lockdown, they're on quarantine, they got laid off, they have other things, other motivations. They're saying, okay, I've got some time on my hands. I'd rather than go and look, go and do work for someone else. Let's see what we can do. And so it's been interesting how that.
And I think it's one of those things, right? Like you got this time on your hands, you see things that are broken. Mm-hmm. Right? You're like, well, this kind of stinks. I don't want to do it. I think there's a lot of that too, that people have seen stuff that, oh, this could be done better. Yeah, which has been interesting.
So now that kind of brings us up to where you're at today. And there's always so many more things on the journey that I'd love to touch on. But given that we don't want to, I'm sure the listeners don't want to hear about all of our side notes. So maybe with that, we'll jump to the two questions I always ask at the end of each podcast. So the first question I always ask, and you may have already touched on it, along your journey, what was the worst business decision you ever made? And what did you learn from it?
Yeah. I would, the spending money before really having a good idea of what you're trying to accomplish. I think it's one of those best and worst because I learned from it, right? But it could be a killer, depending on how big a project you're trying to do. $70,000, $80,000 to build an app is not unheard of, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a big chunk of change. I think that's the biggest lesson I've taken away is really before. Now you can spend money, but like before you go down too far, make sure what you're doing somebody's actually going to pay for. And that's a hard, right? Because again, every startup person thinks, well, when Jeff Bezos started Amazon, nobody was going to buy books. And we all have to think that that's our thing. But, you got to have some sense of realism. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, definitely makes sense. And I like that because, it's interesting and kind of a side note, but you touched on it, is people think, oh, it's software. It should only take a programmer a few hours. It's not that big of a deal. And I've been on programs where I've seen companies literally spend millions of dollars on software. Yeah. I've done several projects myself where at least in the hundreds of thousands, and even just a simple product most of the time, unless it's drop dead simple and it's like, one web page or one little tiny thing, you can get it for cheaper. But if you have one of those apps, and the interesting thing is the simpler you make it is usually more expensive because it's almost counterintuitive because the easier of a user experience is simpler and more straightforward, that it's fluid, takes more time to make that user interface and that graphics and that flow all work together. It's much easier to build a really complicated, hard to use software that has tons of features but doesn't make any sense, it's hard to use, than it is to make that simple one. So definitely think that that's something for everybody to keep in mind. So as we so now with that as the first question, let's jump to the second question, which is, now if you're talking to someone that's just getting into a startup or a small business, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give them?
Yeah. Maybe not have the dream crusher in your life, but someone that you can go to and say, here, like someone that's going to be real with you and honest about your idea, not in a negative way, but a good sounding board. Looking for that person in your life, whether that's like I am incredibly blessed because I've got a couple founders that I just reached out to on LinkedIn and I said, hey, you're where I want to be in the auto space. can we chat, right? And they've been great at, like, and it's interesting because they're very diametrically opposed founders of companies in their philosophy of growth and that stuff. So I've got two, but to be honest with you and say that's not a good idea or that's a great idea, and here's why, because there are holes that we all have, even as, you know, multi-time founders. There are things you miss that if you have somebody else just like throw back at you. That would be my advice, is
No, and
try and
even as a word of, because sometimes it's hard to find those people, but even what I found kind of
yeah,
along the lines is I'll write down, because I'm the kind of guy that I'll have 10 ideas before breakfast, and then I'll have another 20 throughout the day, and 90% of them or even more are probably bad ideas. But what I'll do is I'll write the ideas down that I think might be good. I'll put it on a sticky note, put it on my desk, and I'll leave it there, circle back in about a week and see if I'm still as excited a week after that I've had the idea
that's a
as
good
it
one.
was
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
Because, you know, giving that time and that, because every time you have an idea, you'll say, oh, that's a great idea, it's gonna make lots of money, we're all gonna be millionaires, and
Yeah.
that's what everybody thinks. And sometimes it's right, but other times
Yeah.
you get so excited about the idea that you never really stop to think, doesn't make sense and doesn't work. So
I would
I think,
also, I think the other one for me too is juxtapose, like, listen to yourself. Like, it is really hard to do this, and then you have to be committed. Not just passion is the right word, but like you have to, like, sometimes even your friends and family. I'm sure, like, there's lots of family. Like, I know you were talking with somebody about raising, and that whole, like, well, if you can't even get your family to support you, why should we? I think that's the craziest thing. Like, because your family's the first one that knows all your flaws, right? So they're gonna be the ones that are like, I'm not giving you $1, right? And you have to push through that and listen to yourself, and like, this is a good and that's a hard thing to do, right? When you're going through it sometimes. So those are my piece of advice.
So,
Yeah.
well, awesome. Well, as we now wrap up the podcast, if people want to find out more about your business, your software, Recall Rabbit, they want to be an employee, they want to be a investor, they want to be a customer, they want to be a client, they want to be your next best friend, any or all of the above.
Yeah.
What's the best way to reach out, contact you, or find out more?
I would say LinkedIn, always a good way. It's Stephen Granger, spelled with a PH and no I. And then our webpage, obviously, recallrabbit.com, all one word. Yep.
All right. Well, I definitely encourage people to reach out, connect up, find out more. So
yeah.
Well, thank you again for coming on the podcast. Now, for all of you that are listeners, if you have your own journey to tell and you'd love to be a guest on the podcast, we'd love to share it. Just go to inventiveguest.com and apply to be on the show. 2 more things as a listener. 1, make sure to click subscribe in your podcast player so you know when all of our awesome episodes come out. And 2, leave us a review so other people can find out about all of our awesome episodes. Last but not least, if you ever need help with patents, trademarks, or anything else, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we'd be happy to help. Well, thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been it's been a pleasure, and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.
Thank you.